by the end of the week. So you have plenty of time to look those over, right? It's just a matter of carving things out of my schedule to be able to find the time to get everything done. So, right, keep in mind if you've got some that you haven't yet turned in, is this enough light for you guys here in the middle? Okay. If it's not, we can ask Karina to open. Karina, why don't you just do it? Open that up about a third of the way. And that would give a little bit more light back there. Other way is open. That's good right there. That's perfect. Excellent. Just enough light to see on a cloudy day like today. If you've got some worksheets that you haven't gotten in yet, now is the time, right? Because the next couple of days I'm going to be sort of every 20 minutes I get, I'll be trying to get through 3 or 4 more of the worksheets and get them back to you. Okay? We left off, I believe, talking about the realist movement, which began in the mid-19th century. In fact, coincided with the Third French Revolution, which was mounted by the revolutionaries because the king, that iteration of the king, Louis Philippe, was out of touch, right? In particular, out of touch with the working class. And we saw Daumier's cartoon of him that showed him as gargantua eating nothing but tax money and crapping out bureaucratic positions for the Senate. And in 1848, with the Third Revolution, there was a refocus on the needs of the poor from various government programs, right? And this led to an art movement that did the same, that wanted to focus people's attentions on those people who had not been part of the dialogue within French society, and using art for social justice, right? To show people in the cities, in the salons, in Paris, what life was actually like for the working classes in the rural areas. And we looked at a number of these different images that really focus on sort of what a struggle this can be, right? And so we were looking at Millet, we were looking at Breton, both of them showing us rural work as a noble activity, right? It's something that these aren't, icky, dirty people that you need to avoid, but these are humans, right? And the work might grind them down a bit, but at the same time, they're often presented to us monumental, very, very large, right? As people who have a really great sense of dignity from their work and deserve our respect and deserve our attention as well, right? The Colza picture on the left is huge. It's 6-7 feet across the base, right? It's really presenting these rural workers on a scale that's usually reserved for royalty, right? And that indicates to the viewers the degree to which this is something that merits our attention, right? In the same way that we'd always given attention to saints, or to kings, right? Every bit is important. Julie.
I was going to ask about that, about scale. When we talk about realism and depicting the everyday lives of people at these huge scales as a way of kind of elevating their
right.
lives, are there any that, at least for our purposes, the ones we discussed, that are exceptions to that? Like, are there not massive scale?
Yeah, the Millet on your left is on your right is about like this, right? Not everyone is that large, but sometimes they do use it as and that brings up a kind of an interesting point. I won't get too sidetracked because we are kind of running behind. Just suffice to say that historians tend to refer to the larger pictures as salon pictures, with the idea that they are meant to sort of make a splash at the salon, right? Put on a large scale so that with the hundreds of pictures in the biennial salon that was run by the French Academy, right? Then this is meant to make a statement, right? Other ones are smaller pictures, sort of easel pictures, if you will, that are intended for sale because, of course, is something we should talk. We're not really talking about the business of art too much, right? But an artist can't only make big pictures and survive because you're alienating a hunk of the picture buying populace out there who don't have a house big enough or enough money to pay you for a 3.5 by 6 foot picture, right? So we definitely do see quite a few of them, and this is one of the ways in which art history lies to you because the Millet looks bigger than this one does on the screen because we like to give equal time left and right. But in fact, it's significantly smaller. Probably about like this, right? Fit the corner of that. Okay? So it's a very good question. They're not all big, right? But sometimes when they are, and certainly the heavy hitters, the gleaners, the stone breakers, these are very large pictures, right? And intended to make a splash, as is Breton's picture of the Colza.
Selfishly, I was thinking about if one of the realism pictures happens to be an essay on the exam and we want to talk about it, we should know.
And if you made that mistake by talking about realism making, mundane pictures big, and it happened to be the Millet, which you didn't know was smaller, I would not mark you down on that. Okay. We wound up then looking at Manet, right, who takes this realist idea and focuses on contemporary images of the city. A little bit less of that sort of social justice theme that we saw with the rural painters, right? But still shares the idea of making a modern art for the modern world, focusing on the particularly contemporary parts of Paris, and doing so in a way that is very untraditional, right? And that's kind of where we left off, looking at the railway, where he shows us behind them the chasm, the man-made valley, if you will, of the Saint-Lazare train station, right, of where the tracks open out from the train station and begin to spread their different ways, right? Now, realism as a movement is very much interested in the modern world. That's one of the tenets of the movement, is why they call it realism. These are pictures of real activities, real contemporary activities. And they're answering not only this governmental shift, which focused attention on the working class, but they're also answering critics who, looking at the Salon, had said, hey, there's way too much history painting going on. Who cares about ancient Rome, right, neoclassicism? Who cares about allegories, romanticism, right? What we need are real scenes of the real world. And that's what gave rise to the term realism. It's not necessarily about how realistic it is, right? So Manet picks up this idea, gives us real images of the contemporary world, of a nanny with her charge, right? The girl she's taking care of, stopping for a bit of fresh air. Pollution wasn't in people's minds as much, right? Taking fresh air by the train station, I don't know. But nonetheless, taking a bit of air with a puppy dog and the girl, and you can read narrative into this, right? She said, okay, you bring the dog, but you're in charge of it, and then of course she ends up holding it for her, right? But bringing a book so that they can enjoy a little lunch, and now being interrupted by Manet, right? Whomever is talking to her, us, the viewers, right? But presenting this in a very, very untraditional way, right? And that's really where we left off, was talking about Manet's technique, which ended up getting him in a lot of critical trouble. He applied paint in patches, which the critics called tache, which is just the French word for patches, right? Applied the paint in patches. And they didn't like this. They said, we just see patches of paint. I don't see bones in the face. I don't see bones in their hands. I don't see a sense of structure. I don't know where they're coming from, because I do. But that's what they were saying, was that they were criticizing, in fact, the way that Manet painted, by leaving the brushstrokes so obviously unblended, right? Where you can follow the hand of the artist as it moves over the canvas. You can see where he's been, like footprints, right? The different strokes, the white built up on top of the blue with the bits where it's dragged sort of dry across the surface, or up in the upper right corner of the detail. You can just pick up all these areas and you can actually see sort of the structure of the construction, can't you? You can sort of begin to understand how he built up the surface to get to the finished product. These are all the traces of the artist's activity. And that reminds us on a certain level of the fact that it's artificial. That, in fact, this is a pictorial creation, right? Now, realism isn't about being realistic, right? Realism is about real scenes, real images, the real world. And Manet's pictures are often very artificial looking, in that when we get up close, they don't look like Van Eyck, David, right? Jacques-Louis David, Ingres, whose pictures show no brushstrokes, where everything is blended to an enamel-like surface. This is the traditional way of painting, and Manet is breaking the rules consciously. And that's part of the realist agenda, to make a modern art for the modern world. And he was relentlessly criticized for this throughout his entire career. Okay? Critics looked at this, and they looked at the way he applied the paint and the looseness, the lack of blending, the lack of what was commonly called finishing the picture. And they said that he's making fun of us. We do not like this. The jurors of the Salon were usually the highest ranking members in the Royal Academy who championed the traditional ways of painting. And they thought that Manet was making fun of them. Manet was mocking tradition, right? And this, through the course of his career, got him in trouble. Now, the Railway is relatively late in his career. He dies in 1884, so it's 10 years or so before his death. He died of venereal disease, lost one of his legs in the process. But had by this point been painting since around 1860 or so, a little bit earlier. So we're sort of midway through his career, and he's become really quite well known, partly as a scandal, partly, at least with other painters, as the man who's really doing something different. It was his earlier works that really set the stage for this criticism of Manet as mocking them, the critics, right? Here, a work that he painted in 1863 shows his favorite model, Victorine Meurent, who was a professional artist's model and also a painter herself, although none of her paintings have survived. We just have records that she actually painted, right? And that's her again in the Railway. You can probably tell from looking at their faces, right? Sort of boxy features, chin and whatnot, right? In fact, the Railway is the very last picture he ever painted with her as a model, right? But she was his favorite model. She appears in probably a good dozen Manet works. And it's indicative to us that Manet is painting things in the studio. We got to remember that, right? That even though this illustrates the Saint-Lazare train station, he did not set up easel out there. It's created in the studio, right? A fabrication of being outside. Manet preferred to paint in the studio. The Olympia from 1863, also posed with Victorine Meurent, was actually finally exhibited in the Salon of 1865. He held on to it for a couple of years before he exhibited it. It's a fairly large work. Olympia, or Victorine, is roughly life-size, a little bit smaller, but roughly life-size. And when this went into the Salon of 1865, the critics were vicious in attacking it, right? And the attack was basically that Manet is making fun of us, that his application of paint, and I'm not going to sort of go into details of that, right? But his application of paint is mocking the traditional ways that artists were meant to paint, mocking the kind of teaching that we're doing at the Royal Academy, right? But in addition to that, they also thought that that Manet was making fun of artistic traditions in general, because his picture is an update of a painting by Titian that was really well known, right? The Venus of Urbino. I don't think we've seen this yet. We've seen other Titians. In fact, we had one on the midterm. And in fact, we had an image of Venus from the National Gallery that we looked at as well. And you can see, if we look at these side by side, right, that the similarities are too many to ignore. And anybody who saw Manet's Olympia saw immediately that this is his version of Titian's composition. He's changed certain things, but green curtain pulled back in the upper left corner, white sheet that rises to show a red cushion underneath, the basic placement of the hands, although when Mark Twain saw the Venus of Urbino, he said it was the nastiest picture ever made because of the way her fingers curl, right? Suggesting something very naughty, right? Manet made it a little cleaner this way. Both of them, I saw you pointing in the background, right? We've got the servants, right? In Titian's case, they're rummaging for clothing or putting clothing away, whereas in Manet's case, she's bringing flowers, right? But obviously it's homage. He certainly is channeling what Titian had done and giving us a modern version. And this goes back to how realism first started, right? Which was that realism started because people were complaining that there were no images of the modern world. So that when people in future generations look back at 19th century France, right, this was a big review of one of the salons. When people look back at 19th century France, they're not going to see anything that reflects this culture. And since that culture was modernizing rapidly, they thought it was worthwhile documenting. Right? Our critics did. So, what does Manet do? He takes a famous Renaissance picture and gives us a 19th century version of it. Right? Showing that, in fact, what we saw in the Renaissance, we also see today. In other words, the Renaissance wasn't so special. That mid-19th century France is every bit as important and special as ancient Renaissance Italy was, right? That's the kind of statement he's trying to make. And he's doing it rather knowingly. The Venus of Urbino is a nickname for this painting. She is not Venus. There's nothing there that says that she's Venus. When we see images by Titian of Venus, she'll have Cupid with her. Wings, right? Something that says that she's Venus, right? Little guy with arrows. In this case, there is nothing that says she's Venus. And in fact, she isn't. She's a courtesan. She's a prostitute. And this was painted as a wedding gift, go figure, right? For the Duke of Urbino. Or it's his son, the Duke of Urbino to be, right? Was painted as a wedding gift for him. Right? Probably a portrait of his favorite courtesan, or maybe just a bit of erotica for him, right? And Manet knows that. And he gives us Olympia. Olympia was a name used by many prostitutes in Paris in the 19th century. Because when the realism movement started, right? Scenes of contemporary life. It wasn't just painting, it was literature as well. And there was a very famous book, very popular book that came out about the life of a prostitute, showing again to the people the difficulties encountered by the rest of society. And the protagonist in this book on prostitution, right, this novel, was in fact named Olympia. Right? So that became sort of well known, association between Olympia and prostitution. So in Manet's case, he's also giving us literally a modern version of what Titian's is all about, right? But the nickname that Titian's gets is kind of crucial. Because the reason people called it Venus is it makes it safe. Venus is supposed to be naked. That's all well and good. But, you got a picture out there in a gallery that's simply called prostitute, right? Staring right at you. You brought her some flowers, right? Boy, there's something that changes the dynamic of viewing, doesn't it? Right? Because it's okay for goddesses to be naked, but not everyday people. And that was part of what people didn't like about the Olympia, was he confronts us with the idea that this is a modern prostitute. And he confronts us, I'll point to Shaka and Brendan here, that we're the ones that brought the flowers as well, right? Because we're caught at the moment when the maid is delivering our nifty little gift to Olympia because we've come as clients, right? And Olympia couldn't care less. You know, she has that look on her face, which Manet is really good at. These sort of direct confrontational views, right? You know, go back to the railway. Look at the way in which they look at you, but they don't reveal anything. That urban anonymity is one of Manet's great strengths. He loves this idea. And it's what makes him so strong as a painter is the degree to which he is modernizing painting. He is not only painting in a way that was untraditional, but he is also making us very aware of, and this is going to sound really sort of contemporary, but the way in which a painting comes to life when it interacts with the viewer. That it's not necessarily just an inert object, right? But it has a dialogue. That his paintings address us and make us aware that we're looking at them, right? When someone is looking directly at you, then you're aware of it, right? So if I give my whole lecture staring around, and then it'd be different, like weirder, right? Especially if I stood up close, it would be very strange. But you become aware of the dialogue when you get that eye contact, right? And if we think about the fact that a lot of times Manet's use of the medium, the paint, is also making us aware that it's a painting, then that whole thematization of the act of looking becomes really fascinating and modernized in his mind. Now, when this came out in 1865, at the Salon of 1865, it was relentlessly criticized because people didn't see it as an homage. They didn't see it as a respectful updating of what Titian had done. They saw it as mockery, more of the same. Manet making fun of the way things are done. Okay. And one of the things they would point to, for example, is how Titian uses his little puppy dog, right? Asleep. Great, because she's a prostitute, right? Dog's a symbol of fidelity. It makes all sorts of sense that the dog would be asleep as we're visiting a prostitute. Turns into a cute little kitty cat, right? With its back up and its eyes aflame and a sort of erotic sexual metaphor, right? People pointed at this and they said it's just proof that he's having a go, that he's making fun of Titian, he's making fun of us. This reputation dogged Manet throughout his entire career, right? And it's an important thing to keep in mind. There's Victorine Meurent again, in one of his most famous works, The Luncheon on the Grass. This was also painted in 1863, submitted to the Salon of 1863, right? The Salon before the Olympia was seen. And again, it's confrontational. Right? She's again looking directly at you. And it's made more confrontational because she's naked and doesn't seem to care. Her clothes are right there. Right? She's not nude. She's not a goddess. She's naked. She's just taken off her clothes. And you've walked in to this little private party. And she doesn't care. She doesn't try to cover herself up. And this was shocking to people. Right? It's Victorine Meurent again. Again, his favorite model. We think it's probably a body double, though, like only the face, because the build is all wrong, right? She's thinner than the model in The Luncheon on the Grass, but it's definitely Victorine's face once more, right? So we're being confronted with nakedness in public, and that, again, caused an amazing amount of discomfort, and this idea that we are just going to be stared at by this woman, and the two guys around her, Victorine, right? The two guys around her also don't seem to care. They don't seem they're French. They're talking about philosophy or something, right? They're engaged in conversation while she's there wondering, like, when are you guys going to get done? Hey, who are you? Right? They're not paying any attention to me. Maybe you will, right? And that was seen as terribly, terribly shocking, right? This picture is also an update of a Titian. This Titian, which we did talk about in class, is in the Louvre in Paris. So Manet knew it really, really well. And he seems to be suggesting that what we have is something very similar. Two guys engaged in some sort of dialogue, accompanied by a naked woman. For Titian, they were inspirations, right? They were muses who helped inspire their songs, drawing water from the well, playing the flute, right? There's obviously an erotic overtone to all of this, the flute, right? Manet also gets that. He understands that, and he adds this here. The problem was, of course, is that she's no muse, right? She's eating lunch with them. On top of her clothes is the basket of fruit. That's lunch, right? So she's taken off her clothes and then got the fruit and put it down on top of the clothes. So she's just out there eating peaches and apples naked with these two guys. She's not an allegory, right? She's really there. And this was part of what really sort of ticked off the critics. Yeah. Also, the overall arrangement of the figures, Manet borrows from other works of art. This was a design by Raphael, right? Renaissance painter Raphael, that was carved into an engraving by Marcantonio Raimondi, who worked with Raphael to publicize his prints, to print and circulate them. And we had the Judgment of Paris on the left. We've talked about that theme before, but we just have three water gods hanging out by the side of the river. And Manet has updated that to these three people hanging out by the side of the river. And it's perfectly fine for gods to be naked. That's what they're supposed to be, right? They always have been. But Manet doesn't give us gods, right? Manet gives us real people. And they confront us with their nakedness. Right? This made him, like I said, a very, very huge scandal. So he submits this to the 1863 Salon. It's big, right? Julie, it's a Salon picture. He means to make a statement with this, right? He's answering the call of realism. We need images that elevate the modern experience to something grand like we see in history. And he uses Titian and other images as a way to do this. It's rejected. The critics say no. We do not want this picture in the Salon. Right? And it turns out that that year, 1863, not only was Manet's picture rejected, but the critics rejected, the jury rejected almost half of the entire group of works that were exhibited or were submitted. Over 2,000 works were rejected that year. And there was an outcry on the part of artists saying that the jury is out of touch with what's going on in art today, right? These works deserve to be seen, and the jury better get their head out of their butt, right? Move forward like art is moving forward. And the outcry was so strong that the jury exhibited all of the rejected work at a separate venue across town called the Salon of the Refused Work, the Salon des Refusés. The Salon of the Refused Work. And everybody went because they wanted to see sort of how could this be so bad, right? The jury, I'm sure, just wanted to show people, look, just look at the two shows and you'll see which one is better. I think that's on the jury's mind, right? Prove to you guys that we were right. But everybody went to the Salon of the Refused Works. And in fact, more people went there than the actual salon, right? And at the center of the show, at the center of the hubbub, was the luncheon on the grass. Right? Now, this is an important moment in 19th century art history because, especially in France, prior to 1863, the place, the one place for your works to be seen by the public, by a lot of the public, was the Salon, right? The Royal Academy Salon. And that German show was a major event on the social calendar. It's like the Met Gala, right? I mean, everybody went, okay? Like, we're fully in motion. Everybody should go. everybody went to the salon every single year. If you wanted your works to be seen, that was the place. If you wanted your works to sell, especially the big ones, right? That was the place, because the people who went were the people with pretty fat wallets, right? And it was a great place to sell your works. And then there were those prizes, like what Anne got, right? The Rome Prize and various other jurors' prizes to be received. So the salon was this place, right? And because of that, the jurors in the academy was able to sort of control the production of art, determine what art should look like. After the Salon of the Refused Works, that stranglehold on art in France that the Royal Academy had began to break down. Because other artists alongside Manet, many of whom are friends with Manet, are also beginning to break the rules in how art is produced. And they begin to think that maybe, just maybe, there's another place where I can exhibit my works. That maybe I can circumvent the salon. Because if I put it in the salon, they're going to reject it. Right? So this is a really important moment, the Salon of the Refused Works in 1863, because it's a moment when people started to question the traditional structures of art production, art display, art sales, right? Particularly in France, which is the most avant-garde anyway of the art world in the 19th century. Okay. So what's coming up next? This leads us to the Impressionists. Right? This is how the Impressionists really got their start. Was that they decided in 1873, a group of artists, many of whom had been rejected regularly by the Salon, got together, roughly a third of them, called themselves the Society of Independent Artists, right? Late 1873. And they made plans. We're going to exhibit our works together. We will be our own jury. We will find our own venue. Screw the Salon, right? We're out here on our own. And we will exhibit these works as a collective of artists, right? Society of Independent Artists. And they mount their first show in the spring, like April of 1874. I think it's again in like November of the previous year. Get this idea. They all, okay, let's go. Let's get our best stuff, right? And they open up their show in April of 1874, 2 weeks before the Salon, right? And this is absolutely a crucial detail. They opened it 2 weeks in advance of the Salon because, one, they wanted to steal the thunder, right? Two, they didn't want anybody to think that they put the show together because they got rejected. Right? We're not here because we're not even going to try. We don't care anymore, right? If they mounted it in July after the Salon had opened, everybody said, oh, couldn't get in the Salon, right? Had to have your own show. So now they're sort of saying, nope, that's not what it's all about, right? This is all about the fact that we don't care anymore. And what happens from this point forward, right, is that the annual Salon, biannual Salon, becomes less and less important in the eyes of the art world. And in fact, by the 1880s, it's gone. Right? So from the Salon of the Refused Work in 1863 through the Impressionists, what we see is an alternative way of exhibiting, selling paintings. Right? And it's what we have still today, which is you get a dealer. Right? You mount independent shows where you have a gallery owner who might jury those, but it's not the people who are trying to control the way in which art is taught. Right? So the modern world, the modern art world, the modern world of art display, art galleries, art salesmen really begins here. Right? Now, the Impressionist show goes up spring of 1874. Right? 30 different artists. Monet, the most famous of them all. Right? Criticism of the show is mixed. Some people love it, some people hate it. It's about 50-50. People tend to make more of the critics than the people who praised it. because one of the critics said that when I look at the show, all I see are sketches. Everything looks as if it's just an impression rather than a thoughtful analysis. And the critic seizes on the painting on your right, Monet's Impression Sunrise, and says that all of these works look just like impressions. And in fact, Monet often does try to make his works look as if they're spontaneous, momentary, which adds to the idea of an impression, right? Think about what the word means, impression, right? One, it's a stamp, but insofar as thinking is concerned, right? What do I always say? Don't rely on first impressions, right? Because they're not thoughtful. They're just sort of what strikes you momentarily. It's the opposite of thinking, right? It's feeling, if you will, sensing, rather than processing. And Monet wants to get that point across. And so he often makes his pictures look more sketchy than Manet's are. We look at the Impression Sunrise, and we look up above the sun, you can see a lot of the bare canvas kind of coming through the reds. If you look down below at the waves, they're just individual strokes of paint with no attempt to blend them whatsoever. He's doing his darndest to look as spontaneous as possible. Right? That adds to the sense of impression, because what Monet and what we'll find other impressionists are very much interested in is trying to capture with paint the fall of light, the quality of light and color. Right? I'm off my notes and I'm way ahead of myself here. I've got some blue boxes coming up on this screen. We'll see what order we come up with. As we get to the point of light and color, one of the things that's setting the Impressionists apart from any other movement at this time is that the vast majority of them are painting as much as they can outside, right, in the fresh air. And they're doing this because of a relatively new development, which is tube paint, right? We're used today, take a color theory class, you go buy some tubes of paint, right? Little tin metal tubes with a plastic cap on it, right? Keeps it all nice and moist inside. Those were first invented without the plastic cap, with a metal cap, in the late 1850s, right? Prior to that, paint was ground in the studio and stored in little pieces of pig's bladder, right? Intestines, that was knotted off and made a little sack that you could tie off. But you can't take these things outside, right? You can't travel with them. And what the invention of tube paint did was it allowed artists to start working outside rather than inside. So landscape painters could actually do their landscapes outside, right? Still relatively modest scale, right? You can't go outside with a Constable 6-footer, right? These earlier anyways, 1820s, before tube paint, okay? So we've got artists working outside. And that's one of the things that distinguishes Impressionism. Now, Impressionism is a group. I want to back up and sort of catch up with my PowerPoint here, so far as I remember what's coming up next. A couple of things about Impressionism. One, it is the logical outgrowth of the realist movement. The Impressionists are, like the realists, not interested in illustrating narrative, right? No book illustrations, whatever stories they're trying to tell. They are not interested in historical scenes. They are not necessarily interested in allegories. In fact, they're not at all interested in things that are subjective. Right? Their works are very much objective views of the world around them, which is what the realist movement had been. And many of the artists that we associate with the Impressionists were in fact working for a long time prior to the formation of the group. We're only looking at Monet's Impressionist works, but he was around in the early 60s, right? Getting rejected from the Salon, just like Manet, who they were friends with, right? So it grows out of realism, okay? second thing about Impressionism, right? We tend to think of Impressionism as looking like that, right? Monet, their calendars, right? Broken brushworks, bright colors, painted outside, kind of a general avoidance of black, right? Everything is color. The group of 30 artists who got together in 1873 to form this group, right? Independent from the Salon, they are all over the map, right? The only thing that holds them together is they're sick and tired of the Salon, right? We tend to think of Impressionism as being, oh, it's Monet, and the guys who look like Monet. But those are the ones we remember the best, right? If we go back and we look at the shows that they put up, they are literally all over the map, right? So the group, remember, didn't call themselves the Impressionists. They called themselves the Society of Independent Artists. After the negative review of the first show, they said, okay, we'll take that term, right? Now this group, not only are they all over the map, but they vary from show to show. It's not like your Marymount ID card, right? So for 4 years here, you're a Marymount student, right? Every time the Impressionists put up a show, and there were 8 shows over 12 years. It was not every year, right? The second show was not until 1877, right? 3 years later. 8 shows over 12 years. No single artist was in all 8. Not even Monet, right? I think the closest anybody came was Pissarro, was like at 7, right? But nobody hit all 8 shows, even though they were all alive. So it was a revolving membership, if you will. The group itself did not have a core group identity. Even though in, the way we think about them today, we think about them having just like one thing, the Impressionists, right? They didn't. So keep these things in the back of your mind as we're going to look at 5 Impressionist artists, that their works are, in fact, very widely varied. So it grows out of realism. They don't have a central identity. One last bit of trivia. You will often see Manet called an Impressionist. He is not. If we think about Impressionism as being the title that we use for this group of 30 artists that started it in 1873, 1874, and then exhibited with this group over the course of the next 12 years, Manet was never part of that group. He never, ever showed with the Impressionists. In 1873, when they got together to try to circumvent the Salon, he was an obvious choice. And they asked him, why don't you come with us? Yeah. Hey, Eddie, right? You've been rejected by the Salon more times than you can count. Why don't you join up with us? Just get rid of this whole idea. We'll show things together. They asked him to join us, and he's hanging out with them all the time. He and Monet are really good friends, right? There are Manet paintings of Monet at work, and vice versa, right? He says no. He wants to work with the Salon. He wants to change people's minds. He wants to fix the system rather than break the system, right? So he consciously says, I do not want to join you guys. So if anybody ever tells you Manet is an Impressionist, you can say, no, right? Or if you're doing your crossword puzzle, it says Impressionism, 5 letters, and it's M blank N-E-T. If it's not Monet, then your crossword puzzle editor is wrong as well, right? He was asked to join, and he said no. Right? And it points to a crucial difference between Manet and the Impressionists, which is this idea of working outside. Manet never worked outside. Manet works in the studio. The Impressionists are working in what they called en plein air, in full air, right, in full atmosphere, is what that means. They are actually painting in the out of doors. Now, what are they getting at by doing this? What are they trying to do as a group? Particularly Monet, what is Monet trying to do here, right? Because not all of them are doing the same thing. Let's talk about Monet. By painting outside, Monet is hoping to capture the quality of light as it fluctuates through the course of the day. And so he wants the paintings to look spontaneous because light is always changing, because weather patterns change. And he wants to focus on how light reflects, refracts, moves, translates into colors that we see, and how this changes from second to second. And so what he wants us to, I'll get in a second, Brittany, what he wants to show us is a painting that looks like he knocked it out as fast as he possibly could. Because the theme of the picture is the play of light in this area. Right? And I've got more on that. I'll get your question now.
Did you say he paints like Manet because he's kind of patchy?
It's very patchy like Manet, and Manet has that also a spontaneous quality, right? And this brings up the point where I'm leading with this, right? Is that it's totally artificial. They're anything but spontaneous, right? I think Monet begins these things outside, but he'll finish them in the studio, right? He'll get a lot of the ideas out there and get the sort of sense of color. But the more we look at Monet's work, the more we can see that there are areas, I think it'll come up in the sort of the next detail, where one color is laid over the top of the other color after the lower level has dried. So it can't, oils take a long time to dry. Part of the fun of using oils is blending the colors on the surface, right? And that's what the Academy wanted them to do. But Monet's work often shows, well, here, I guess you can see a little bit of it right here. Here's some brown in the water that's been placed over the top of the blue. See that in the lower left corner there? And you can see that in order to do that, right, and we see this throughout his work, throughout his career, that he will, if he did it wet on wet, you'd get smearing. But he doesn't. He does it wet on dry, right? So it's already hard underneath. So this belies the fact, right, that it's done quickly. He just wants you to think it's done quickly. Now, for Manet, that spontaneity, I think, was really kind of all about modernism, right? Making modern pictures in a very modern way. For Monet, that spontaneity is wrapped up with the idea that the light quality we see right now in this particular picture will be different than that, right? As those clouds move through. The clouds break and we get full sun, it's not going to look the same as it does right now. The clouds gather, it's not going to look the same as it does right now. You won't get the same bouncing of light off of the water, refracting off of this bridge. This is part of the reason, this is the town where he lived, Argenteuil. How do you take notes? This is the town where he lived, right? It's outside of Paris. It's not a suburb, really. It's kind of an independent town. It's more like an exurb. It'd be like living in Frederick or something. It's just far enough to be rural. But it was approachable. It was close enough to get to, right? And Monet chose to live here. And people came here on the weekends. Because it's the place where, the Seine River, which runs right through downtown Paris, right? It runs right by Notre Dame. So it snakes its way through Paris and then works its way up to the North Sea. Snakes its way through Paris up to the North Sea. And this is kind of over here, before it goes up to the North Sea. And as it gets to this area, it widens out. It gets really cold. And it became a very popular place with Parisians to go and sail, right? Rent a sailboat, or maybe even stow your own sailboat if you're wealthy enough out there, or better yet, rent a little rowboat, like what we see here, where there are a cute little couple of lovers, we assume, in a rowboat, right? And Monet chooses to live here because of the quality of light, because of the width of the river and the reflections he gets, and the air, right? This is why he loves it here. And then he'll take the pictures back into Paris to sell with his dealer, right? Or show in the Impressionist shows. But this is where he stayed. And in the image, he gives us this new bridge, brand new bridge, right? Built after the Franco-Prussian War. A road bridge that connects Argenteuil to Paris. That allows Monet to get there more easily. There's a railroad bridge, the next one down, right? That's the one you usually take in. but allows access between these rural, far-flung suburban regions and the capital of Paris. And that is the focus of this work. We can talk about it the same way we talk about Monet's work as a symbol of the rebirth of Paris after the Commune, after the Franco-Prussian War, right? Great progress and success. But for Monet, that massive stone structure, right, is part of the play of light. And that's what he's trying to capture. A number of nice details here, right? Getting in on top of it. Where you can see, look at the very top, how that glom of white paint is laid over the pink. Or if you look at the buildup of the strokes that make up the dance of waves in the foreground, right? It's built up slowly, even though because he doesn't blend them, there's a spontaneous feeling. That spontaneity is picked up by this mast in the foreground that goes nowhere, right? There's another ship out of frame, right? Another boat. And he makes it seem sort of casually composed, like a snapshot, where he hasn't bothered to fit everything within the frame itself, right? All of that makes it look incredibly spontaneous, right? I don't know if this is any better. Probably should have cut this one. This is an older photo, kind of pixelated a bit. But you can also begin to see these places where he's laying the paint down over other strokes and using the color on the bridge itself so that the stone of the bridge picks up all of the colors reflecting off of the water. And we see these figures on top of the bridge profiting from this wonderful view that they have on the top of that bridge. You know, industry throughout the history of landscape painting, industry has always been a problem. Progress has always been a problem, right? Landscape painters like unspoiled landscapes, right? Constable, right? Loves an unspoiled landscape. For Monet, our landscape is spoiled. Progress is here. Industry is here. But Monet shows it to us in a way that suggests that maybe he's looking at it as a positive thing. Now, to drive home the fact that his principal theme here is the play of light, Monet will go back and will paint this same structure again and again and again. Sometimes from the same point of view, sometimes from very different points of view. And then he would display them together, right, on the same wall. 5 different views of exactly the same thing. Sometimes as many as 12 different views of exactly the same thing. And the overwhelming effect of seeing them again and again and again is you stop paying attention to the bridge as the theme of the exhibition. And instead, you start paying attention to the different qualities of light, the different temperatures, the different times of year, the different times of day, right? The different qualities of weather. So as we see them again and again, right, the road bridge still remains important. But seeing them together, Monet is emphasizing his overall agenda, which is to focus on how light changes. And what better way to do that than to show the same thing on repeated times? So in this particular view, right, he's at the far end, he's on the other shore, and on the opposite side of the bridge looking to our left, right? So the bridge house that you see there is what we see at the end of this bridge on the other side, right? And looking under that span and up this river, sort of this direction to our left, right? Another one, again, from local collections, also from the NGA, on a gray day. We're now sort of right where we were in the first picture. We were on that hill on the right. And now we're looking back at the bridge, the opposite direction. We see the boathouse now, which he excluded from his other picture, and the number of boats that are gathered around this basin. But again, as we see these different pictures together, we become aware that the bridge may be ostensibly the theme. But by displaying them together, Monet's particular emphasis becomes the play of light. And that's what we associate most with Impressionism, right? That's Impressionism to us, is this Monet approach to the modern world. That's all light and color. And also often all relaxation, right? Outside of the city, yeah.
Are they the same scale as sort of the realism?
No, no, gosh, no, because, especially because it would have been possible to paint those outside, right? He, in fact, Monet, at one point, Monet wants to paint something as big as a realist picture, right? As a salon picture. And he's gonna do this image, he has a couple that he's gonna try. One of them is his variation of the Luncheon on the Grass, sort of homage to Manet. Another one are these women in the garden, right? And he wants to sort of paint in his own garden. That gives the opportunity to do something big outside. He doesn't carry it anywhere, right? This painting still exists. It's in the Orsay Museum in Paris. And in order to paint it outside, it's like 8 or 9 feet tall, the canvases, right? Which is you're painting. What are you gonna do, right? You're gonna get a ladder, right? He ended up digging a ditch in front of where he's painting, and he had this pulley system, so it would lower the, so he could just stand there. And then, you know, had his wife out there, and she's posing, painting, and he okay, I gotta do the trees at the top, so and down it would come, and he would paint the top, and I would go, and he would get the bottom of it, right? And he posed his wife 3 different times, or 4 different times for this picture, right? Just to get this idea of 4 women in the garden. Right? But on the norm, Impressionist pictures are very, very small, simply because of the way they're working, right? Which is to say the biggest ones are about like yay, right? Sometimes they'll get bigger, right? But the majority of the ones that are painted en plein air are going to be small enough to take 5 or 6 out with you at any given time, right? And you can imagine how Monet is working. Right? He'll move from site to site, or even if he's at the same site, he'll put one aside as the weather changes. Pick up another one and start that one, right? And then back to the studio with sort of mental notes and finish them up to capture those different qualities of light that we see. Right? So this is what we most associate with Impressionism, which is this approach toward flickering, changing qualities of light that we associate most with Monet. But like I said, the Impressionists were not a unified group, right? Not everybody in the Impressionist group did exactly the same thing. Another of the founding members is Camille Pissarro. And he seems less interested in light quality than he is with the subject matter. For him, the subject matter becomes crucial. Now, his approach to painting is very similar to Monet's in that he leaves the brushstrokes unblended, right? It still has a spontaneous and sketchy quality that we associate with the Impressionists. But for Pissarro, the central theme, the central interest, is life in the countryside. Monet is a suburbanite, right? This is not really the countryside. It's a little town. And he focuses on this town and the vacationers who come and the boats and the water. Pissarro wants to be a bit more rural. And as we think of the topography of France, he's a little further down the Seine, right? A little bit further afield from Paris. And he focuses in particular on the rural working class. That's a typical realist thing, right? The rural working class. But for Pissarro, they're never really working. Or if they are, it's never really hard. They don't seem to sweat, right? There's no colza here, or potato gatherers, or road menders, right? The stone breakers. Rather, he looks at these people in these rural farm villages, and he sees them walking to market, taking a moment to chat by the fence. Not really hard at work. And this comes from Pissarro's own politics. He really believed that cities were destroying the psyche of modern man. He truly believed that rural life was better than life in the city. So I think it was last class, Elizabeth was asking me about that elevated view we had down over the busy street of Paris. That was a Pissarro later in his career, right? And that idea of sort of looking down on it like God from above, we could take as almost being a judgment of it as well. Right? In this case, he puts us right in the middle of it, right? Down on the level of our rural workers and a taking time by the fence to simply chat with the woman while someone else wanders back from their chores or off to their chores in the city. Another Pissarro is still painted in that traditional Impressionist manner, and in this case, showing a woman on the left gathering sticks for fire, a man on the right, I presume, gathering nuts, perhaps, right? So a basket of some sort. They're actually working, but at the same time, the work doesn't seem so terribly onerous, so terribly difficult. And by making the figures small and incorporating them into a landscape that kind of overwhelms them in a way, right? That landscape that takes up so much more of the subject. He's showing mankind in harmony with nature as part of it, right? Rather than focusing only on the human activity, which is sort of self-mediated, right? Where they're right up front and huge. So part of the Impressionist movement, part of the original 30 who got together, right? But not necessarily doing exactly the same thing that Monet is doing. A third Impressionist who you've probably heard of before, also an original member of the group, Edgar Degas, hated the term Impressionism. Right? When they picked up the label, when he heard the criticism, and the Impressionists decided, hey, that's not bad, let's use it, he said there's nothing impressionistic about my work at all. My work is very thoughtful, very deliberate, very thorough. Right? Impressionism is not what I'm doing. He said, if you want to give me a label, I'm a realist painter. Focusing on the working class. Right? That's what he'd rather be preferred to be called. And so he's a member of the Impressionists, and some things he shares, broken brushwork, but a lot of people have that. This filtering of light through the space. But it's really about human activity. And inside, no less. The vast majority of Degas' pictures are inside. Now, this is definitely working class. We need to step out of our modern ideas of, Misty Copeland and the ballerina being, the prima donna. She's a working class woman. This idea of being a star, right? A star ballerina. Because ballerinas in the 19th century were very, very low class women. Usually women that came from orphanages and came from the working class, so they had sort of stockier builds. Which was important for dancing, and they were referred to usually as theater rats. They were not as respected as they are today. They were sort of, the grunt working class of the theater world. Came out and danced around other performers. And the ones who had star quality were actresses, right? Actors and actresses. And ballerinas were not seen the same way. So Degas is focusing really also on an impoverished working class group, right? The only way they survived was to receive gifts from wealthy donors. Right? And most of them came from very, very poor backgrounds. Okay? And that puts him directly into this camp of realist painting. Like Monet, he does multiples, right? He loves repeating the same theme over and over and over again. And for Degas, it's not necessarily about a different fall of light, not about a different atmosphere or time of day or time of year. For Degas, it's about the human body. These athletes, right? Women who are physically trained for a very particular kind of performance and not actually performing. Practicing, resting, stretching, getting ready to perform. So if we look at the dance class on the right or the dance lesson on the left, you'll notice that while they might be posing and working, none of them are performing. This is not a public space. In both of these images, we are given a privileged view behind the scenes. We've entered into their world. And this has brought up a lot of discussion about Degas. What the heck is he doing there? Right? Giving us this view view behind the scenes. We talked about that with Ang or Delacroix when we looked at those images of the harem, right? They give you a privileged view of a private world. And it's a world that is mostly foreign to men. So what is the God doing there? Is his work slightly twisted, misogynist, privileged in looking at them? Because you'll notice in both of these that we're kind of looking down on them too, right? We're above them. As I am now standing while you're seated, right? There's this elevated view looking down. That suggests a hierarchy of artists up here, ballerinas down there. That could add to this idea that maybe this is slightly strange, right, into God's work. Well, we're out of time for today. We'll pick up the God on, I guess it'll probably be next week, right? As we try to wrap things up. Because on Friday, again, we'll be talking about some of the pragmatics of the paper. If you've begun to work, please bring your questions with you. I'll certainly have time to answer questions from the group as a whole. But we'll go over sort of what's expected, make sure that it's sort of clear to you what you should be working on as you kind of polish things up over the weekend. Again, paper not due until a week from Friday, right? But we'll talk about it on this Friday.